Okay, let's get serious now. All right, if you want to run down the TAB or something and put on a bet, this election could be decided in the next couple of days. So for the best guide to who will win and where, I've asked on Tom Connell, Chief Election Analyst here on Sky News, and he's equipped with his amazing election wall. Tom Connell, thank you so much for your time. The national figures are one thing, Tom, as we've said before. Each seat is different, and the battle for the marginal seats is what will actually decide this election. Now, these are the seats that the leaders will, of course, be spending most of their time trying to win or defend. They visit those seats most. So which ones have those leaders been focusing on in the past week, and what does this tell us about the state of play?
Well, the past week, the vast majority of leader visits really go to the seats they're interested in. Scott Morrison is right across the country here, and only one visit to each of these. But these last week visits are crucial. They don't waste any time. Leichhardt, yes, that seat is still spoken about, so trying to shore that up. But look at the rest. They're all Labor seats, interestingly enough. He's on the offensive here. Blair in Queensland, Parramatta in Western Sydney, Lingiari, the Northern Territory. It's still a seat that's increasingly on the radar for the coalition. Solomon, I think, less so, but it's next to Lingiari. Sometimes you get a coincidental visit. And then Lyons, the only seat here in Tassie. Again, that's him on the offensive. Corangamite and Griffith as well. Let's look at Anthony Albanese. So you've got a sea of red for Scott Morrison. He's trying to be on the front foot there. For Anthony Albanese, a bit more of a mixed bag. 3 Liberal seats over there in Perth. Hasluck, Swan and Pearce, but then a bit of a mix around here. Solomon, Brisbane, Fowler, Bennelong and Canberra. Don't worry about Canberra too much, by the way, Andrew. That was his National Press Club address. I don't think he's trying to shore up votes here in the capital.
If he was, he'd be in real strife, I have to say. All right, well, let's go through those battleground marginal seats, which are going to decide the election. It's interesting that Morrison thinks he can pinch a seat or two off Labor. But let's see, let's get an idea of who will end up with the most seats when we go through these following ones. So let's start with Perth and Adelaide and Tasmania, Tom.
Perth, interesting. I feel like this result is tightening somewhat as to expectations. Looking at those battlegrounds right now. Pearce, I think this seat's right in play, but Labor is hopeful rather than thinking they're definitively over the line. What's interesting is I'm even hearing in Swan right now, look at that margin, 3.2%. The coalition's feeling better about that. One that might move, we weren't thinking would, is Curtin. That would be an independent that would be taking that one, part of the so-called teal movement. So Labor's expectations just down a little bit in Perth, possibly. We'll see on that measure. South Australia, only one up for grabs here. Nobody's talking about Sturt that I'm talking to. Boothby right in play. I think Labor favourites in that seat and they'd be feeling relatively good about that. Tasmania's quite interesting as well. We've been speaking through this election about Bass and Braddon. I think they're both a chance to fall. No one's saying definitively. If one goes out of the two, my money would actually be on Braddon over than Bass. But Lyons is interesting. I'm hearing increasingly, Andrew, that we're going to see more visits from Scott Morrison there, that he is on the offensive there. Remember, this seat, look at the size of it. It's more a national type seat. It's a regional seat, and the Liberal Party disendorsed their candidate there last time. So they feel like that 5.2% margin is very gettable.
All right, I'm going to, give some Liberal and national voters a little bit of heart. I'm going to say just the net loss to the government of 2 seats. Remember, if the government loses 7 seats, the Labor Party is in with a majority. If it loses, I don't know, I would say 4 or 5, Labor's in with a minority government with the support of the crossbenchers. So far, 2 of those 4 seats that would threaten the government. Now, you've said, Tom, that in the past, Queensland and Victoria, they're unlikely to see huge movement, but you still think there are some interesting seats there.
There are, and Queensland, look, if you want to talk about the possibility of the government getting returned, the less movement in Queensland overall for them, the better. Only 2 areas we're really looking at here. In Brisbane itself, I think this is still the seat most likely to change hands in Queensland, but no one's saying yes, it will change or it's a strong chance, just that it's right in play. And Ryan a little bit less so. It's got similar demographics. You've got a bigger Green vote there coming, so a bit of a Green Labor pincer movement on the government. So both chances, but neither of them feel like it's a definitive chance of shifting. Blair, the attention of the government, I'm not convinced that will shift, but it gives them something to attack there in Queensland. When we're looking at the rest of the state as well there in Queensland and regional battlegrounds, and this has become really not much of a battle at all. Flynn will be the one Labor concentrates on the most in terms of that central Queensland area. Leichhardt, I think, is still in play, Andrew, and we have seen visits from both leaders there, but it seems to be more like, well, we're going to visit somewhere up in the north there. I think Warren Entsch has a chance to lose that seat, but you'd have the coalition as favourites in Leichhardt.
And Tom, what about Victoria?
So I should mention Victoria as well, and some of these seats. This is where it gets quite interesting. I'm not going to assume that much happens to Casey. It's a watch on the margin more than anything else. Chisholm, knife-edge seat, but no one willing to call it either way. Then you get to the other ones. Higgins, I think, is a chance to move. Look at that 2.6%. Labor got some of the margin last time. There's been a redistribution. I think they're a chance, but you'd still have the Liberal Party favourite. What's interesting out of Kooyong and Goldstein is that increasingly I'm hearing quite confidence from the Liberal camp that Josh Frydenberg will hang on, but if there's one teal seat they're most worried about, it's Goldstein there in Victoria. So they're the Liberal seats. As for Labor seats, Corangamite is number one with a bullet now for the Liberal Party. Previously, we spoke about McEwen. Look, it's still on a watch list. It's the interesting sort of outer suburban area. But Corangamite, it's a 1% margin. It's an area with sort of peri-urban areas as well. They might not have been a big fan of the Andrews government. So Corangamite, number one with a bullet for Liberal targets there in Victoria.
Okay, I don't know, Tom. I'm going to say net a loss of 1 to the government, and this is to a teal, but let's count that teal because it's someone, that ABC person, Zoe Daniel. She's going to be on the left, so that's 3 seats in all now that that Labor's probably, or a Labor coalition kind of thing. Labor and Teals have taken from the government. They need probably 1 more, 2 more to get a Labor minority government in. And that all brings us down to New South Wales. Tell us about that.
And this is still where the election's going to come to in the main part. Look, we've already got essentially 4 battlegrounds we're trying to cram in here, Andrew. Sydney, first of all, and this is a story of the government feeling better about Wentworth, quite confident about Wentworth, much better about North Sydney. Why? They feel as though Labor will finish ahead of Kylie Tink, and the preference flows from Kylie Tink will not favour Labor as much. So they're feeling much better about North Sydney. Banks, I think, is in play. The margin is the government's friend there. The Chinese vote could be an interesting one in Banks as well, and how that plays out. So then you get to, I think, Labor's best chances in all of New South Wales. Reid, I think that's a very strong chance to fall. You could almost put it down. And Bennelong increasingly spoken about. You've got an incumbent stepping down in that seat there. So that's Sydney. Then you get to the central and northern New South Wales battlegrounds. Interesting areas here. So 2 different areas essentially, Dobell and Robertson, Central Coast seats. Labor has the smaller margin, but probably a slightly better chance of picking up Robertson than Dobell. How that ends out, difficult to say. They could both go one colour or the other, but if I were going to have a pick there, I'd say the incumbents stay. And I'm not tipping actual movement in the rest, but this is an interesting area. Hunter, Patterson, Shortland. Now, Hunter is the seat that has the most concentration. The Nationals trying to win this off Labor. Again, Joel Fitzgibbon stepping down. There's a chance that goes, but neither side thinks there'll be movement now in the Hunter overall, just that it's a strong watch. It could surprise, but right now the prediction is not for that to happen. Our final one here, New South Wales Liberal target seats, and this is where it gets interesting. Eden-Monaro, there's talk of more resources going there. I'm not convinced Eden-Monaro shifts. Gilmore, the strongest chance for the Liberal Party in New South Wales. Labor not giving it away, but Andrew Constance, a very strong chance there. Parramatta, a really interesting seat given what's happened there with Andrew Charlton. I think that's going to be very close. Macquarie too, it's an ultra-tight margin. But Labor feels as though there's enough going their ways, for example, in terms of how the flood situation plays out there. So there's a lot of seats here, Andrew. The summary in New South Wales is, you mentioned the scoreboard when we get to New South Wales. It's very close. It's easy to see either side winning 3 or 4 in New South Wales. The question of this election right now, I think, comes down to where is the tide going in New South Wales? That will decide who forms government and in what form as well, minority, majority.
Tom, excellent work. Well, from your rundown of seats, and we're being generous to the coalition, it looks like it's coming down to the government losing 4 or 5 seats, one of them to a Teal independent, and that means it's up for grabs. Who can negotiate best with those independents and that Teal? I would suggest it's Labor, probably, by 1, but we shall see. We shall see. It could all surprise us on Saturday, and I wouldn't be even surprised if a majority Labor government. Thank you for your time. Tom Connell.